Hello, and thanks for joining the talk today. My name is Tarang Khandpur. I also go by TK. And today, I'll be presenting Internationalization is my Lieblingsfach, which in German means favorite subject. I promise you that the title will make more sense a little bit later. But let's go ahead and get started. So in this presentation, we'll be going over internationalization in Appian. So I've organized this presentation into three different sections: the importance, the implementation, and finally, a demo of internationalization in Appian. And then we'll wrap up with some resources to help get started with some of the things that we'll talk about today. And I wanted to mention, there is going to be a lot of information on the slides, but we'll make these available to you later, so don't worry about taking photos or screenshots. All right, let's jump into it. So before we begin, I wanted to give you all a quick introduction. I'm a senior consultant working with Mastodon Technologies, and I've been working with Appian for just about over 4 years, and I've absolutely loved learning the platform and designing creative solutions for my clients. And as a topical fun fact, I actually speak 4 languages. Puedo hablar español, मैं हिंदी भी बोल सकता हूँ, mo nihongo wo hanasemasu. So kind of a topical fact for this. All right, let's go into it now with the importance of internationalization. So internationalization is often abbreviated to I-18N because there are 18 letters between the I and the N. So in order to discuss the importance of internationalization, we first have to define what it even is. And it's the process of designing and developing an application to be localized for target audiences that vary in culture, region, or language. In other words, it's making an app accessible to international users. Now, this is much easier said than done. The world is a massive place, and its people are extremely diverse. To account for all our cultural differences is a monumental task, but one that we should all strive to understand and implement. Which brings us to our next slide: where do we implement it? So at a high level, internationalization can be broken down into 4 categories: text and language, currency and number formats, dates and times, and UI UX. But you can see there are a plethora of aspects to consider in each of these categories. And we'll dig into these more specifically in the next section, where we discuss how to implement internationalization with Appian. So when talking about the importance of internationalization, we have to discuss who it affects. Now, first is the expansion for business. It allows businesses to grow and expand into new markets, which allows them to provide solutions and services to as many people as possible. But it isn't only about expanding the reach of businesses. It's also about expanding the accessibility for people. Through understanding cultural differences and establishing equal access to services, we can provide internationalization solutions for people individually. Internationalization is an expansion for how users from different cultures can work and interact with each other. I'm sure every app or solution that you've built on Appian has hundreds or thousands of users. It's imperative that we design solutions that are accessible to everyone, and that we pay attention to the cultural differences between the locales in our systems. This often means more than just translation and involves aspects of design, such as color psychology. So here's an example of a Japanese website and an American website. And you can see here the differences in the color psychology and of the layout of the website entirely. At the top, you can see that the Japanese website uses red in a lot of its text, which in most Asian cultures represents good luck and happiness. But here in America, red is often associated with an error or a destructive action. So here you can just see how varied and different the layout of the design could be, also accounting for things like text direction, where some cultures will read text from right to left or up to down. So the last aspect I wanted to talk about with regards to the importance of internationalization is our imagined future. Most of the time when we develop software, it's for solving an immediate problem. But to really understand the full impact of internationalization, it's important to imagine the future you want to develop. I personally see a world so closely globalized that trade is between people, not nations. And in that world, everyone has access to the same resources and tools as everyone else. Differences in language and culture will definitely still exist, but the technology will be so perfectly internationalized that everyone will have an almost equal user experience tailored to their cultural preferences. All right, now let's move on to actually implementing internationalization with Appian. To begin discussing how to implement it, we'll break up those categories we saw earlier, and for this presentation, we'll just focus on the first three. It's still important to consider UI UX when internationalizing your apps, and a few things to be aware of are icons or symbols that have different meanings in different cultures, and overall design patterns, like I mentioned earlier, with text direction. So we'll break down each category into three parts: what we want, how do we achieve it, and additional considerations. First up is text and language. This is likely the most prevalent part of the internationalization effort in your app. The biggest focus here is usually on translation. So let's tackle this using our three steps. What we want is a dynamic interface that is translated based on the user's locale settings. How do we achieve it? Well, in previous versions of Appian, you would have had to create multiple database tables to track the key value pair of a term and its translation, including reference tables from multiple languages. Another way was to use the Load Bundler plugin with a file for each language that housed that same key value pair. But now, with the latest versions of Appian, you can use the new translation set object for all labels and static text on your app. And for dynamic values, like lookups and dropdowns and other UI components backed by the database, you can utilize a code language table to include the translations along with the IDs and language code for each lookup value. And remember to always use a translator when available. Good internationalization requires fluent knowledge between the source and destination language. As a quick example, idioms like piece of cake or break a leg will make absolutely zero sense in any other language. So after that, we'll talk about some additional considerations for text and language as well. And yeah, so let's take a closer look at achieving what we want to. So here's a quick screenshot of the new translation set object. And we'll take a closer look at this in the demo. But here you can see it includes a handy grid displaying all of the locales in the system. It also allows you to export strings and send them to your translator directly, and then easily import them back into Appian. In addition to the translation set, in order to translate lookup values, you can add a column to existing lookup tables, including the code language and the translations for those specific values. Now, these will have to be sent to translators separately, but since they usually aren't as prevalent as other components of internationalization already included in the translation set, it's usually not a massive effort. Now, there are still a few additional considerations as well. While Appian has made translating apps extremely easy, it's still important to consider a few of these aspects of the database. And these are: which types of character sets does your database use? Now, there are various kinds, like ASCII, ISO, and Unicode, which determine which characters, letters, or symbols are supported. For internationalization, compatibility with Unicode is necessary since it can encode more than 1 million characters and encompasses almost all languages. So this also brings us to which field types can be included in various databases and which support Unicode. And here's a quick reference for some common databases. And lastly, I want to mention that it's important to be aware of the concept of collation, which simply determines the sorting order of the characters in your database and in your languages. And as a quick example for that, you can see here, should the ñe character in Spanish come before or after the n? So that's a consideration where if it's important to your requirements to know the sorting of the characters, that you pay close attention to the collation set in your database. So that concludes the text and language portion. Now let's move on to currency and number internationalization. Now, there are many aspects of internationalizing currency and numbers that we have to be aware of here. And here you can see just a few of them. For the sake of time, for this presentation, we'll just focus on currency. So the format of how currency is written can be extremely unique across locales. Here are just a few examples. Here you can see the same number, but written in 4 different formats across different regions. The pound adds 1 layer with a new icon. The euro adds another with swapping decimals with commas where we're familiar to seeing them. And Japan and the yen doesn't even have decimal precision. So you can imagine just how varied this can become as we add more currencies. Now let's walk through our 3-step system again. What we want is a system that allows for the input and display of all required currencies to convey the same amount. How do we achieve it? The first step is thoroughly understanding the system requirements. This will influence the design greatly. And after that, we'll discuss that database design. For this, there are 2 common approaches: a single currency system and a multiple currency system. And then we'll take a look at some of the Appian out-of-the-box functions that we can use to implement internationalization of currencies. And lastly, we'll just quickly touch on a few other considerations when it comes to internationalizing numbers. All right, so how do we achieve it? Requirements. It's important to know what the system will be used for. Are we building a stock trading system or a storefront? This will influence whether or not we need to track and store points of data like exchange rates. Inherently, we want all representations of a currency in our system to be reflective of the same value of a particular item. In an asset management application, this could mean tracking and displaying values based on current exchange rates. Now, there are 2 design patterns to facilitate this. This single currency system, and with this approach, when a user enters an amount in their currency, we convert it to a base currency when writing to the database, or a multiple currency system, where the database stores the exact value that the user entered and conversions are done when retrieving and displaying the data. Now, each has its pros and cons, and we'll get into them in a little bit. But I wanted to mention again here that there's a lot of text on the screen, so don't worry, these slides will be made available online later. All right, so let's take a closer look at how the database could be structured for each design. And to do that, we'll walk through an example. Let's say user A lives in Spain and sees everything about the application in Spanish. And they enter 10 euros into the system to indicate that they've gained 10 euros of wealth. Now, let's say user B lives in England and enters the same 10 Great British pounds into the system, indicating they've also gained. If the system doesn't have a base currency or rarely needs to convert values, the multiple design works best. With a multiple currency approach, in order to represent the equal value between currencies, you would need to store the exchange rate to and from each currency. Since the number of combinations you have to store has the potential to be fairly large, another approach is to do a double conversion and convert the given amount to a base currency and then back into the desired display currency. In this approach, you would need an exchange rate for every currency to the base currency. Now contrast this with a single currency system, where the stored currency should be the one that's most frequently used in the system to limit the number of conversions that need to take place. Here, you would need to store the exchange rate for every currency that isn't the base. So next I want to highlight that for internationalization of currencies, Appian provides us with the ever so convenient A-band currency function. So this function takes in hundreds of ISO codes, and you will likely still need to manually map the user locale to those codes to make it a seamless dynamic UI. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through these slides just in the sake of time. So there are a couple of additional considerations for currencies as well. And we can take a look at those later, or I can address them as questions after the demo. But let's move on to dates and times. So there are two important considerations to make when discussing dates and times, and that is the format of the dates. So here you can see a quick example. This date could be represented as April 3rd or March 4th, depending upon your locale. This one here, you might think is December 27th, 1402, but is actually a date used in Iran and is for the 17th of March, 2024, where they use the solar Hijri calendar as opposed to the Gregorian calendar used commonly in the West. So let's go back to our three-step program here. To view and display a common date and time of related information, that's our want. How do we achieve it? Well, Appian tries to make this process simple by ensuring that all date and time values in the database are in GMT time. Anytime a date or time is written or retrieved from the database, it is saved in GMT and then calculated as an offset to the user's locale. So as an example, EST is calculated as a 4-hour offset. And lastly, there are a few additional considerations, like I mentioned, with that solar Hijri calendar. And those kinds of custom calendar types will require custom solutions. All right, so just to quickly jump into the demo, unfortunately we had some technical trouble and we couldn't get the screen share working up just in time. But here you can see that I have a report which contains a plethora of the information I discussed earlier. At the top, you can see currency. Next to that, you can see date and time, and as well as everything else on the screen, which is the translation of the text here. So after implementing our features that we talked about today, you can see all of this information translated into French dynamically and easily. So you can see that all of the text on the app is changed using the translation set object, as well as the dates and the currency amounts. So just to give you guys a quick view into a little bit of how that's done, this is a view of the translation set object, where each row here represents a value in the system and includes features such as the dependence. So you'd be able to see the dependence of each of these values, and as I mentioned earlier, be able to easily export and import them. You can also adjust the columns here to quickly and easily include other languages as your system expands. Here you can see the currency rules that we use to dynamically generate a display of currency. You can see here we're using the match function to match the user's locale entered in the system with the ISO code for each currency. You can see below that is a rule to query the exchange rate. And here's where you would implement some of that design I talked about earlier between single and multiple currency databases. For each of those, you would need to include a from and to ISO code to know where you're pulling from. Here's another match function for the date and time, where you can see that the dates and times have been formatted to account for the display of that information in each user locale. And then use the abank text function to properly display that on the front end to users. All right, I know it was kind of rushed, but I still want to thank everyone for their time. Highly encourage you to take the survey. Lastly, while I'm walking out here, hopefully this works. A fun little video that inspired the original title. Enjoy.